Welcome to my Week 5 presentation where I have chosen to discuss the Service Employee International Union. In this presentation, I will give background information about the union, also whether there has been a change for the union since the ruling of Janus versus AFS CMC, and discuss my peer-reviewed article, and finally close it off by sharing my news story on the Wisconsin Act 10 bill. So as I stated, the union that I decided to talk about in this discussion is the Service Employees International Union. Also, it's mainly known as the SEIU. The union alone is a very big union because it is international, so they do service the US and Canada. But for the purpose of this discussion board, I am going to narrow it down to just talking about SEIU 721, which represents the Inland Regional Employees. So it is a union that I'm familiar with. The union represents a wide variety of employees, but it is separated into three categories, which are first the healthcare employees, which consist of hospital and nurse employees. Second is the public services employees, which are employees who service at a local and state government level. And finally, property services, which are janitors, food service workers, and security officers. Since the ruling of Janus versus AFS CMC has been decided, there has been a change in SEIU. For SEIU 721 specifically, it has changed because since the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, it explained that public employees can no longer be required to financially support a labor union against their will, which prior to the ruling, this was being done by SEIU. So this meant that SEIU used to force all employees, whether they were union members or not, to have union dues collected out of their paycheck to support the union. And they did consider it a fair share fee because it was explained that whether you were a member or not, you should have to pay because you benefited from the gains the union brought for the workers. So now this means that SEIU 721 employees can opt out of having the fair share union dues from being taken out of their paycheck. And it was controversial because employees didn't want to participate in being a union member or have the dues taken out, but others believed that this would cause a free loading system because people would not pay their union dues or participate, but they would still benefit from the changes that the union can bring. The peer-reviewed journal that I selected was titled Public Sector Unions, Democracy, and Citizenship at Work. So the article explained the evolution of public services and public sector unions in the United States. The article stated that it focused on those two things because it explained that in order for a union to be effective, it does need to look into the changes that the public sector has gone through. So it is no surprise that times are changing constantly, and of course, public sectors have to go along with those changes. But another aspect that needs to change with the public sector is the public unions in order to meet the employees' needs. It explained that a strong union will adapt to what is going on in the environment and during that time. Unfortunately, the article does not mention the passing of Janus versus AFS CME, although I do think that it would be a good addition to it because it does talk about the evolution from start to finish about public sector unions. It also explained how public sector jobs help become an economic ladder for African Americans and women because public sector unions protest for diversity. Even though the article states that union members are better able to voice their opinions at work and have access to due process, and employment actions, it explains that the union only works if the union listens to what the employers need. And the reason why I say that the recent ruling should have been included is because the article does touch bases in terms of how to gain members voluntarily because, as we know before the ruling, people were forced to pay their union dues in order to, whether they liked it or not, they still had to pay their union dues whether they were a member or not. But the article explained how the unions and the employees should work as co-partners. And finally, for the Wisconsin Act 10 bill portion, I found an article through the New York Times called Wisconsin Legacy for Union, and it was by Stephen Greenhouse, and he focused mainly on the impact that Bill 10 had. And so Marty Beals, a labor leader who has a union called Wisconsin State Employees Union, he explained that it had a devastating effect on the union, and he complained that their take-home pay had fallen more than 10%, and that staff had to be reduced, and that the building that they were operating from had to most likely be sold because it was being underused. It also explained how Act 10 restricted public employee unions from being able to bargain collectively, and how, social workers, prison guards, nurses, and other public employees felt little incentive to pay their union dues for a union that would not be able to represent them effectively. So it was surprising and new information that I learned and how it affected employees and union workers, but it also tied into the discussions because, even with my previous article, it explained how people don't feel inclined to participate and pay towards a union that won't be able to represent them. Thank you for listening to this week's presentation. I know that in some slides I mentioned, I said Janus versus AFS-CMC, but I know it's AFS-CME. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to listening to your guys' presentation as well. Thank you.